started. How's everybody doing this morning? Good. Good morning. Welcome. So today, the question I pose is, are Texans taxed too much? I think many of us in here would probably believe that we are, all right? And so I'd like to go over some issues here in my opening remarks, and then we have a great panel to discuss maybe some tax reforms, some things we need to look at here in this upcoming legislative session that begins next week, and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with what the Texas environment looks like and what we're going into in this 84th legislative session, or 84th Texas legislature. So total spending here at the state, if you look at the overall budget, has increased 64% since 2004. And if you compare that with population growth plus inflation over this period, adjusted for that, spending is up 13.4%, costing Texans an additional $1,800 per for a Texas family of four, $1,800 just this year alone.
Can I stop you right there?
Sir.
I disagree.
Okay.
The math that I do, the budget in real adjusted numbers is down 11% in the 13 years since I started. And I will show anybody those figures, okay? Love y'all, but I think you're using fuzzy math.
Well, those numbers.
Go right ahead, though.
Okay, all right. we can discuss those numbers. These are from 2004-05.
This is nothing that Talmadge and I haven't very friendly argued about a lot.
All right, I'd love to go over the numbers with you, sir. Okay. We can definitely.
I've got the numbers, and they're accurate.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll definitely go over those numbers together. And so in the upcoming, during the current biennium, this 2-year budget period, there looks to be a sizable budget surplus. Estimates show somewhere in the range of $5 to $10 billion. Now, the drop in the oil price could have an effect on that, and I think we'll get some indication of that when the Comptroller releases the biennial revenue estimate on Monday. But even then, oil and gas production, as far as revenue is concerned, collects about 10%. Whereas the sales tax revenue that's brought in is about 55% for the state's revenue. So even with the oil price coming down, maybe you'll see a drop in some revenue there from oil and gas, right? But that also means that Texas consumers are going to have more money in their pockets as the price of gasoline has dropped. So, I mean, in Round Rock, for example, back in the summer, it was $3.50, price of the pump. Now it's $1.71. So that acts as a tax cut to all Texans, allowing them to have more money to spend on other goods and services, increasing sales tax revenue. So it'll be interesting to see what the balance is there, or could become more of a wash. But somewhere in the $5 to $10 billion range. So as this revenue continues to grow and as the Texas economy continues to expand, this is an indication that Texans are taxed too much with this large amount of surplus that we have, and more revenue that's going to be coming into the 2016-17 upcoming budget period. So with this additional revenue, what we've recommended at the foundation is to eliminate the margin tax. The margin tax was created in 2006 during the school finance trial that found the funding for public schools was unconstitutional. So they put in place the margin tax that was enacted or implemented in January of 2008, which is a business tax, a costly business tax that is placed on the taxable margin for a firm, where it's based on 4 different margins that are based on revenue, not on profits. So it's mostly gross receipts tax. It's highly costly when you look at the amount of compliance cost that goes along with that, trying to figure out what your taxable margin is. Also, there's 2 different tax rates. If you're a wholesaler or retailer, you pay a little bit less than 0.5% is your sales tax rate. Or if you're on another type of business, you pay a 1% tax rate. So there's these 2 different rates, 4 different taxable margins, highly complex overall system, and it's just been a failure overall. It's failed to keep property taxes low, which is one of the issues from the school finance trial of how we pay for public schools. It's failed to bring in the estimated revenue that the Comptroller had projected year after year, and it's failed to keep us out of the court as we have the full school finance trial continuing to go on today. So with these sort of failures, one idea from our mind is to go ahead and eliminate it as soon as possible. So we've been doing a study now on what's the economic effects of eliminating the margin tax. And our preliminary, it brings in about $5 billion annually. So our preliminary results show that for one, it would bring about more prosperity. Over the next after the 5 years after the margin tax was eliminated, it would add about 185,000 jobs cumulatively over those 5 years. Just in the first year alone, 90,000 new jobs compared to the status quo. As you have more prosperity from more real income, right? Real personal income, we show, would increase by about $10 billion over those 5 years, which is how you get to those more jobs being added. Firms are able to have more money in their pockets. They invest, grow their business, increase salaries. And that allows for more consumption and further investment, which allows more job growth. And so we see this as a boom to increasing the Texas model success over time and bringing about more prosperity, particularly for the working poor. And so not only do we have that as one way in order to have tax reform, but another one that we've recommended is what's called the Sales Tax Relief Fund, the STAR Fund. In today's current legislative process, there's not a mechanism in place for funds from one area of the budget to be cut from a particular program. You name the program, right? Cut that funding. Well, those dollars in today's legislative process end up just going into another program without lowering the bottom line of the budget. And so what the STAR Fund would be able to do is to be a mechanism in which we could lower the bottom line of the budget. Hey, if you cut from program X, you could put those dollars into this sales tax relief fund that would go to temporarily lower the state sales tax rate that was determined by the comptroller, right? So not only would it lower the bottom line of the budget, but we would provide tax cut in the process here. And this is something else that we think is going to be a boom, not only for the Texas economy, but it help to reduce the footprint of government moving forward. And so why do we talk about this? What does it matter? Well, the Texas model has been a great model that other states have tried to emulate. And we think by eliminating the margin tax, for example, from all this additional surplus that we potentially could have, we could further the Texas model success. Since December 2007, when the last recession started, Texas has added 1.4 million new jobs. If you take Texas out of the equation for the rest of the U.S., in November was the first time that the rest of the nation was above where they were back in December 2007. They're now at 143,000. To put it another way, Texas has added 10 times more jobs since December 2007 than the rest of the nation combined. By eliminating the margin tax and doing some of these things, if Texans are taxed too much, we could propel this far into the future. And that's something that we'd like to hear about today, and hopefully have some other views on how we could improve the Texas model as well. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our distinguished panel. First, I'd like to introduce Senator Craig Estes. Serves nearly 820,000 constituents across Texas Senate District 30. Currently serves as chairman of the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Rural Affairs, and Homeland Security, while acting as vice chairman of the Senate Natural Resources Committee. A little bit of everything, huh?
I'm right now chair of State Affairs, but that was just to fill in for Bob Duncan.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Gotcha.
It's kind of a transition deal.
I see. Recognized by the Texas Association of Business as a champion of free enterprise, appointed to the Legislative Budget Board by Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst in 2014. So thank you for being here. Representative Sylvester Turner, elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 1988 to serve the people of House District 139 in Harris County. That's where I'm from as well, Harris County, so South Texas, South Houston area. A member of the Legislative Budget Board, Vice Chair of the House Appropriations Committee, Chair of subcommittees on Article 1, 4, and 5, and a member of the House State Affairs Committee. Capital Inside named him the most valuable player in the Texas House, and attended the University of Houston and Harvard Law School. So thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you.
Next up, we'll have Scott Drenkard, who was a researcher at the Tax Foundation's Center for State Tax Policy, author of the annual State Business Tax Climate Index, and editor of the 2012 and 13 editions of the popular handbook Facts and Figures, How Does Your State Compare? He's been featured in a number of different newspapers and magazines. He holds a BS in Economics from the University of Mary Washington and is a candidate for MA in Economics at George Mason University. Good school. Thanks for being here. And finally, we'll have Mr. John Fund, national affairs columnist for the National Reviews magazine, is contributor to the Fox News Channel. Previously served as a columnist and editorial board member of the Wall Street Journal. Author of several books, including Stealing Elections, How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy, and the Dangers of Regulation Through Litigation. He worked as a research analyst for the California legislature in Sacramento before beginning his journalism career. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Senator Craig Estes. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yes.
Didn't mean to be so rude as disagree with you. You got real good after that.
because you intervened.
Would you mind coming up here, sir, or did you?
I'd rather just sit here if that's all right. Can everybody see me? Okay.
All right.
First of all, thank you, TPPF. Y'all are an amazing resource for us. We appreciate you. They have hired just the experts in their field, people like Talmadge Heflin, who wrote this budget a few sessions ago with his help from the Senate counterpart. So it's just all the areas they've hired the best, and House members here, ex-legislators know what it means to us to have the tools we need. Okay, last panel I started with a joke. I've been thinking about Margaret Thatcher and what a great lady she was. She was out to dinner at a fancy restaurant one time with all of her cabinet, which happened to be all men. And they were having a meeting, and the waiter came up to her and said, "Madam Prime Minister, what will you have tonight?" She said, "I'll have the beef." And the waiter said, "What about the vegetables?" She said, "They'll have the beef also." Men, we know where we stand. Okay, the real question we have to ask ourselves, this is the question is, are Texans taxed too much? And I think it's instructive to think about the dynamic tension between funding the needs of a very complex society and at the same time preserving personal liberty. And this is a social contract we've entered into as civilized people. You can take some of my money and I expect you to do some things in return. We don't often think about that, and so the obvious answer to the question is, yes, we're taxed too much, but at some point, theoretically, we could get to the point where we go, yeah, that's just right. You know, no more, no less, just right. And everybody in here has a different view of what that is. But I think it's fair to say that we're not suffering from too little taxation right at the moment. I think the record shows we can argue over the numbers and how they adjust for inflation and population growth. But I think that we could say that Texas has done a fair job, at least, of striking the right balance between that. But there's always room for improvement. Again, Margaret Thatcher said, here's a quote, she said, "You may have to fight a battle more than once to win it." And that's really true. I have been enlightened. I had an epiphany. I voted to create this tax. It got rid of another tax that was pretty bad. But I've grown to realize I think we can do without it. And let me tell you why. First of all, it's not brought in the money that we thought it would bring in. Secondly, it's very complicated. And thirdly, it's arbitrary. At the time, I have since sold my business, but I had a business that did a lot of sales in Texas. And my contribution under the old tax and under the new tax was within a few $1,000s. It was a wash. But many other businesses were not. They were paying a tax, and their taxes quadrupled. So speaks to the arbitrariness of it. So I thought, okay, what can we do? And with the good help of the folks that are putting on this conference, we studied it. And what happens if we just take it out? And the results are pretty astounding. Now, there's all kinds of other things to raise the exemption, to lower the rate, to do this, that, and the other. And all these ideas will be fully vetted. But the main opposition to just taking care of this, and I believe I heard this from my friend Talmadge, is the time to kill a snake is when the hoe's in your hand. Is that right? And did you coin that phrase? The easiest thing to do is not adjust it. It's just eliminate it. But the main argument is we can't afford it.
We can't afford to lose that revenue. And my argument back to them is, if you'll study what the economic implications are of doing this, it's going to more than make up for it. And go, well, yeah, but that'll be a few years from now. This is we're talking about $9 billion in biennium. And I'm going, okay, 2 sessions ago, we were $27 billion in the hole. Corbin, you were there. We solved that problem. That was tough. It was tough. We made some painful cuts, as Representative Turner knows, but we did it. And I guess the thing we're looking at now is, what are the implications for the precipitous price and the drop of oil? What's that going to do to our state budget? We're looking eagerly for the comptroller to enlighten us on that and his forecast. That will be key. But I am intellectually convinced, this is not just fluff, I'm not blowing smoke or anything, that we can do this, and the effect on the state's economy will be dramatic. And all these consultants that study these things, they all seem to be from Boston. Why is that, John? They agree with that. Okay, so I could go on and on, but let me just say, how much time do I have? 5 minutes? Okay. Nobody in my 13 years has come up to me and said, please raise my taxes. I mean, maybe they do that in Austin. I don't know, I tell you, there is one example, though, where people don't mind some people always mind their taxes being raised. But if people vote themselves in a school bond election, I'll give you an example. Judge from Collin County here, Keith Self, Allen, Texas, built a $60 million football stadium. Now, the little aside to it is it's faulty, and they got to tear it down and rebuild it. I don't know who's going to pay for that. Is that not right? They're fixing it, okay. But somebody, a good conservative friend of mine said, isn't that terrible they did that? I said, that's the most conservative Republican bastion in all of Texas. And they voted, what, 80% to build it? So, it's like, okay, if you want to tax yourself, get after it. Go for it. Have a fancy football stadium. Who am I to tell them they can't do that? It wasn't the Democrats that won the day there. It was conservative Republicans that voted that tax for themselves. Anyway, that's an aside. But here's the key for legislatures, is to cut taxes in a way that gives the greatest opportunity for an expanding economy, okay? That's why this is a good idea, because it will create jobs. What did Hillary Clinton say the other day? Corporations don't create jobs. That one statement alone ought to disqualify her from even running for the presidency. Okay, that's idiotic. And I don't think she believes it, because she's a college-educated person. I think she's pandering to the far left. But obviously, anybody knows that businesses and corporations are what create jobs, and government jobs they're not beneficial to the economy. So, having said that, government exists because of private wealth creation, not in spite of it. That's why it exists. And we need to keep that in the forefront of our minds. And I think the voters have made this abundantly clear across the nation this last November. And so this tax, I don't want to rehash everything that I've said, but it always kind of bothered me. They said, well, people need to pay for the right to do business in Texas. And I went, no, wait a minute. Don't we do all these economic development deals and pay them to come to Texas? And now they're supposed to pay us to do business? The effects would be dramatic. So I'm going to wrap up here and say that we can do this. It will work. Behind the scenes on the Senate side, new senators, the older senators, the incoming lieutenant governor, we're discussing what do we want to do. And one of them is significant property tax reform, significant business tax reform. I want to go a step further. I want to say the best reform is just elimination. Margaret Thatcher's, this has come full circle for this. I'm extraordinarily patient, provided I get my way in the end. So we're gonna keep hammering on that door, and we'll get a bigger hammer if we have to. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Turner.
Yes, sir.
Let me just say good morning to everyone, and certainly my pleasure to be here with the senator and everyone else that's on the panel. Talmadge, thanks for including me again. I know when they did the ratings of people who participated in the Texas Policy Forum last year, and I participated, they wanted to bring back the most conservative speakers, and Talmadge included me since I got the highest percentage of the vote for being conservative. So I appreciate that, Talmadge. You know, that was a joke too. I told some of the people outside, you know, I don't know what my role is supposed to be today, but let me just start by saying I agree with a lot of what the senator had to say. I do know when we put in place a franchise tax in 2006, there were some who did question whether or not the projections were going to be on target or not, and then we recognized it was not going to fully offset the 1/3 property tax relief that we was providing, so we added in another $2.5 billion from general revenue. And then it has had a difficult time meeting its projections. But you know, I know the question is, are we taxed too much? I think I maybe want to broaden the context for the few minutes that I have, and maybe pose some additional questions or tag some additional questions to it. One would be, and let me just start off by saying, I don't think Texans want to be taxed more than what they need to be, period. That's across the board. I think for most people, they don't want to have to pay more, be taxed more than what's needed to cover the priorities for the state of Texas. But we can say, are we taxed too much? My question would be, are we taxed fairly? Is the system in which we are operating, is it a fair tax system? That's number one, because I would question whether or not it is an equitable system. I would tag that by saying, I think we have a system that's designed to create certain winners and losers. There are winners in the system that we have. There are losers in the system that we have, and I think we need to be mindful of that. And then I know the question is a surplus. I don't know if I would call what we have, whether it's $10 billion from the last legislative session, a surplus. I think a better way of describing it would simply be a fund balance. And what I mean by that is that we can talk about whether or not we are taxed too much or whether or not it's equitable. But I think it is also instructive to kind of determine how we got the surplus or how we got the fund balance. And that is, we still have dedicated accounts in the state of Texas in which people are taxed or assessed for one purpose, and the legislature is using much of those dollars for another purpose. And so we have roughly about $4 billion still sitting in dedicated accounts where people have been assessed, surcharged, and the legislature, in its infinite wisdom, has decided to only give a portion of that money back for the intended purpose, and we use the other portion to certify the budget and then do some other things. If you take those dedicated accounts out, which means that the legislature has taken your money for purpose A, and then the legislature has used it for purpose B. We've borrowed, in a sense. That's $4 billion that's on the tax books. If you eliminate that and use the money for its intended purpose, or not collect it at all if you're not going to use it for the intended purpose, then it creates a $4 billion hole. Okay, so what do you do there? And I believe a bigger question for me is not just whether or not we tax too much, but whether or not we're being deceptive in our taxing scheme. I think deception is a bigger problem to me. When you're saying people you're going to do one thing, I'm taking your money, but I'm using it for another purpose, and you don't tell them what the purpose is for, I think that's deceptive, and I think that's fundamentally wrong. And I think people should have problems with that. The other thing is diversions. Just like with transportation on Fund 6. We have taken out $600 to $700 million out of Fund 6 and used it on other things. We're going to end those diversions, hopefully, in this upcoming session. And that's about $1.2 to $1.4 billion that you're going to have to find from some other place. And we will find it, I believe, if we end those diversions, because most of that money goes to DPS, Texas Department of Public Transportation. And so when you end those type of diversions, that's another 1.2 billion, 1.4 billion for the biennium. How do you fill the gap? You know, as we look at a lot of these things that are taking place, I think it's important, just like we need to have transparency in budgeting, it needs to be transparency in the whole taxing scheme. And then when we talk about whether or not we should eliminate the franchise fee tax, you know, I'm not so much necessarily opposed to it in the sense, but at the same time, in the last legislative session, we implemented about 12 to 13 exemptions that will end up taking out of the revenue stream about $1.1 billion. And the point that I'm trying to make, as we debate whether or not we should eliminate the franchise tax, it's not like the legislature has not been providing exemptions for other individuals, and because we have. And in the last session, it ended up being about 1.1 billion. And so there are some people who are benefiting from the legislative scheme. There are some people that are still paying. And so, you know, I think what I have seen in being a part of the legislative process, but a part of the Appropriations Committee for a number of years, is that policymakers pick winners and losers, that we have a piecemeal taxing scheme, a system that is not equitable, a system that's not transparent, and a system that's very deceptive. And so what if we eliminate the franchise tax? Do you think we're not going to replace it with something else? And so what's a bigger threat? If I'm having to pay a fee, if you increase my license, for example, from $200, $300 to $500, does that not come from me? Am I still not a Texan? Am I still paying? So you eliminate the franchise tax, but we start taxing everybody else, depending on who's politically strong or who's politically weak. And I think that, to me, is not a equitable or a sound or a conservative system. If it goes against fundamental basic principles, somebody has to pay. Now, I recognize corporations do create jobs, but I also recognize that people pay taxes. They're people. They're all of us. So whether or not it's a franchise tax or whether or not it's a fee or an assessment or a surcharge, the money is still coming from people, and it's still coming from their bottom line. I've been in business now for 31 years. Had employees for 31 years, paying insurance, paying 401s, all of that for 31 years. And I don't want to pay more than I have to pay. But at the same time, I know we have a system that requires infrastructure, that requires investment. For my business, I think for others, it's important to have a transportation system that works. People want to get from point A to point B. They are saying it costs about $5 billion that we're looking for. And even with the referendum that passed in November, we're still about $3.3 billion short. So where does that come from? So we eliminate the franchise tax. Where will the money come from for the investment to keep this strong going so that businesses will look at a state and see a sound infrastructure where they can do their business and do it well? I don't want anybody to pay more than what they have to pay, but I also want businesses to see a state where the infrastructure is sound, the roads are there, and they can do their business, and the state of Texas, from a regulatory scheme, can get out of the way. That's my take.
Great. Thank you, Representative Turner. Scott Drenkard from the Tax Foundation.
Thank you. Vance, you have the little clicker.
I do.
Control-L.
Perfect.
So the title of the panel is "Are Texans Taxed Too Much?" which is one of the most important questions that citizens ask. Am I taxed too much? But one of the questions that I'm most concerned with, and one of the ones we work a lot on at the Tax Foundation, is, are we taxed well? And some might say you can't be taxed well, but you actually can. There are certainly principles that we want to subscribe to when we're coming up with tax policies. For us, if you're unfamiliar with our organization, we monitor tax policy, and we've been doing so since 1937 at the federal, state, and local levels. We have a set of principles derived from Adam Smith, which are basic things that everybody can agree on. These are nonpartisan ideas. We want taxes that are simple. We want taxes that are neutral, taxes that are transparent, and finally taxes that are stable. And we come up with lots of solutions of how to get there. So, is Texas taxed well? The answer is yes and no. Because there are some elements of the code that are very pro-growth, very beneficial, and then there are some elements of the code that, compared to other states, are a complete aberration, are totally different. I'm of course speaking about the margin tax. This is why Vance put me on this panel here. It's the one item that really doesn't fit in. So when we look at things from a national perspective, one of the tools that we use is the State Business Tax Climate Index, which is a comprehensive review of tax structures. We're not just looking at collections here, so we're really not asking the question of, are we taxed too much or too little? We're instead asking the question of, how good is the tax system? And the results look pretty good for Texas. This is a map of the 50 states with the overall scores. Texas comes in at 10th. You've got some other states around here that are in the top 10 in blue, and then the yellow/orange states there. Those are the bottom 10 states. The thing that states in the top 10 have in common is that sometimes they go without one of the major taxes, or they have all the major taxes, like say Indiana, which ranks 8th, but they're structured really well. They have broad bases, they have low rates. The state is doing things to try to not influence personal or business behavior through the tax code. So Texas gets a lot of points. Now I've broken it out between types of taxes within that component, within the overall score. Texas gets a lot of points for not having an individual income tax. And I think if you talk to the average Texan, they'd tell you that that's pretty great. I actually had a friend who had lived in Florida and Texas and then moved to Virginia, and he didn't know that states actually are allowed to even have income taxes until he moved to Virginia, and he was very, very surprised. I think that people don't want to get rid of that sort of system, and it's one of the things that attracts people to Texas. Everybody talks about the Texas miracle. Everywhere I go across the states, people are talking about the Texas miracle, and they seem to recognize that no taxes on personal income is something that's contributing to that. So I want to talk about these two categories right here. I've mentioned that there's no individual income tax, but that corporate score is the worst score, and that's because that's where we're putting the margin tax. In fact, the margin tax is not only in the corporate component of our State Business Tax Climate Index, but it actually bleeds over into the individual income tax component because it applies to pass-through entities like LLCs, S corporations, which are traditionally only the domain of the individual income tax in the other 50 states. So if Texas truly had no taxes on individual income in the way that a state like Wyoming does, they would rank first. Texas would rank first as opposed to 6th in the individual income tax component. And then also, then there's the margin tax itself, which is 39.
Tell me again, why Wyoming is first? Do they have no corporate?
They don't have a corporate or an individual income tax. So they rank first in the corporate component, and they would also rank first in the individual income tax component.
So if we want to be first, we could do what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not. I also, this is a perfect time to bring up that Vance is releasing a paper, which is excellent, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. I'm also releasing a paper on the margin tax on this Wednesday, this next coming Wednesday. It's got all sorts of information on it. I'm going to cover a little bit of what's in there here, but I'm going to save a couple of the really good findings for our release on Wednesday. One of those being, how the State Business Tax Climate Index would have if you modeling what it would look like if you repealed the margin tax. So we've talked sort of about how the state looks in the current situation, and now I'm going to zero right in on the gross receipts tax question, comparing that across the 50 states. The states in red here are the 5 states that have gross receipts taxes. There's only 5 of them left. The states in purple are the states that have repealed gross receipts taxes in the last 15 years. You have Indiana, they repealed theirs in 2002. You have New Jersey, repealed theirs in 2006. You have Michigan that repealed theirs in 2011. And then you have my favorite one, Kentucky, which instituted one in 2005 and immediately repealed it in 2006. And then you have Nevada, which just last November voted down a Texas-style margin tax by 70% to 30%. Something I think it might have been 69 to 31. So these things are really unpopular, and states have been moving away from them over the last 15 years. In the literature review for the paper that we're coming out with, I found that actually governments generally have been moving away from gross receipts taxes since about the 18th century. Adam Smith famously has this beautiful passage in Wealth of Nations. Only I would think that passages in the Wealth of Nations are beautiful. Maybe Vance would as well. Where he talks about the Spanish Alcavada tax, saying that this is an affront to sound tax policy, and he's writing in 1776. The Alcavada tax is very similar to the Texas margin tax, which is pretty funny. I have a quote here from Don Gaspard Melchor de, somebody help me out with the Spanish here, Jovellanos, thank you, in Texas. He's a Spanish statesman around that same time, and an Enlightenment thinker, talking about the Alcavada tax, which is something that they have to comply with. And I actually had an intern translate this for me. The Alcavada tax surprised local produce from the moment it was born, chasing and biting it throughout its circulation without ever losing sight of or releasing its prey until the last moment of consumption. Talking about, this is a really poetic way to talk about the pyramiding effect that gross receipts taxes have. The fact that they're levied at every single transaction for the most part, penalizing businesses exchanging raw products as they turn them into final products. So in many ways, the Alcavada tax, by the way, was repealed, and it was one of the best things that Spain did. They tried them in Latin America and the colonies as well. Those taxes have been repealed. Turnover taxes, gross receipts taxes have been repealed. So gross receipts taxes are in many ways 18th century tax policy. Here's another quote from John Dew, who is a noted tax expert. He wrote this textbook, Government Finance, which some of you might have actually had as your textbook if you took public finance classes. And he has a review of gross receipts taxes, and his quote here is, "The defects of the turnover tax have been made extremely clear by long experience and of course have been responsible for the abandonment of the tax by most countries." They tried it in Italy, they tried it in France, they tried it in other European countries. I mentioned Latin America. All of these taxes were subsequently repealed because they are incredibly unpopular and economically very ineffective. And then this last quote here that I really love is talking about the margin tax in particular, which is not a true gross receipts tax, but is sort of a distorted hybrid. And John Mikesell, who's one of my favorite tax scholars, says, the margin tax is a lot like the taxes that emerged in the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union. This was what it looked like as those new countries tried to come up with tax policy. Many of those taxes have now been repealed as well. The margin tax combines all the problems of minimum income taxation in general, excess compliance and administrative costs, penalization of the unsuccessful business, undesirable incentive impacts, doubtful equity basis, with those of taxing according to gross receipts. So you got the worst of all worlds here. To wrap things up here, the question is, are we taxed too much? And I think that the answer is we really could be taxed a lot better. We could come up with a system that raises the revenue that we need without having all these distortions, without being the one thing that people mention when they talk about Texas and say, you know, Texas is doing great, but that margin tax. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. It's interesting you bring up Nevada because one of the selling points for the legislature was that, hey, Texas is doing it. Texas has a margin tax. Why don't we have one here? You know?
Well, it didn't. It ultimately failed pretty tremendously, and there were people from Texas that went and talked to business leaders and said, listen, you really don't want this thing.
Yeah, it'd be nice if we had another saying they could say, well, Texas doesn't have an income or a business tax. How about that? Spread that message.
Would do it. That would do it.
All right, Mr. Fun.
Okay. All right, I'm the Yankee on the panel. I admit it. It's even worse than that. I'm from California. It's even worse than that. I'm from San Francisco. Now, let me explain. Everyone as a teenager revolts against something, whether it's your parents or something else. I happen to revolt against my political environment, so that's why I'm here. Look, let me be very, very honest with you. Almost everyone, in fact, probably everyone in this room, knows more about Texas taxes than I do. My role is to be the outside agitator who comes into the state and tries to look at things with a fresh perspective. So I don't know as much as you do, but my eyes see things differently because, just like everything else, you look at something with a fresh set of perspectives. So coming to this state and not knowing as much as you do, here's my impression. This panel is asking the wrong question. This panel should not be asking the question, is Texas overtaxed? There's reasonable dispute, although Representative Turner was brilliant. The real issue is deception and hide the ball. Don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax the fellow behind the tree. The real question we should be asking this panel is there enough democracy in Texas? That's the real question. Here's why. I have relatives in Texas. My aunt and uncle live in Richardson. I have nephews and nieces in Plano. Plano is next to Allen, which Senator Estes mentioned. So I do know one thing. I do know the area of Allen and Frisco and Plano and Richardson. That I can speak with authority on through my relatives. Here's what I know. You have a democracy deficit, especially in how you pass local bond measures. You have standalone off-year elections. I cannot tell you how weird this is to someone looking from out of state. Let's look at Allen, Texas, in that stadium, that $60 million stadium with a 38-foot jumbotron. It wasn't 80% approval, by the way, it was 63%. Allen is a population of 94,000 people. When the bond measure approving the stadium and the Performing Arts Center and the Community Center and all the other stuff, which totaled $120 million, when that passed in 2009, in May, voter turnout was 8%. 8%. In a town of 94,000 people, 2,363 individuals voted to commit the town to $120 million in obligations. 2,363 people. Now, the Dallas Morning News has done a great job here. It didn't look at Allen specifically, but it looked at Frisco and how they passed their bond measures. It's called rolling polling. How many of you have heard of rolling polling? Good. Well, all of you should know about it in Texas, because if you are overtaxed, which I don't know, rolling polling is probably the reason. Rolling polling involves manipulating polling locations during early voting to target certain populations and discourage general turnout. Low turnout overall ensures the minority of beneficiaries of the bond will make up a higher percentage of those voting. And by moving polling locations from campus to campus, the district ensures a higher number of those who want the bond to pass, and you know who those are, will actually vote due to a combination of district promotion and practical convenience. Let's look at what happened in Frisco, which has a population of 140,000. Early voting lasted a total of 8 days. During that time, only 9 non-campus voting locations were open to voters. The other locations moved across 49 school campuses, with each campus only hosting voters for a single day. In other words, although multiple schools served as a polling location, each campus was open for only 1 day. Elections typically have half of ballots cast during early voting. But in Frisco and neighboring towns for the bond measure, almost 90% of the votes were cast during early voting. 90%. We don't have election day in these elections. We have rolling election month. 60% of the total votes cast were the result of ballots collected across 49 different school campuses. This includes Frisco and neighboring areas. In other words, this is not democracy. This is the illusion of democracy. And I can give you example after example throughout Texas. And what is the response of the political establishment that built that $60 million cracked Taj Mahal that had to be closed? Tim Carroll of the Allen Independent School District, explaining how the stadium came to be built and can't be used now after $60 million. Quote, "The community felt overall it was necessary, it was time to build the stadium." No, it wasn't. It was 2,363 people in rolling polling. This is a travesty. This is deception. Now, this also affects communities that aren't nearly as rich and aren't nearly as wealthy as Allen. Recently, I had a chance to go to Ferguson, Missouri. And we all know what happened there. And I'm not going to go into the details of what happened there. It was sad. And I'm not going to do the blame game. I'm just going to talk about the underlying problems in Ferguson, which I spent several days in. Ferguson is a community in transition. Texas has similar communities. In the last 20 years, Ferguson has gone from 25% black to 67% black. In other words, it's a different community. But it hasn't changed in its governmental structure. To this day, the mayor, 7 out of 8 city council members, and every single of the 7 school board members is a white. Now, it was a free election, but it was a standalone off-year election with rolling polling. This is how a political establishment, and this is not racial, this is old residents, old contractors, old vendors, old unions, old police unions, keeping their power. This is not racial so much. In the 2012 presidential election, voter turnout in Ferguson was 54% among blacks and 55% among whites, identical. In the election for mayor, city council, and school board, the voter turnout among whites was 18%, voter turnout among blacks was 7%. Now, I'm not one to say you have to have exactly equal voter turnout, but it's understood in an underprivileged community it's going to get harder to motivate people to the polls, especially if it's in May, an off-year election. I proposed, and this has been endorsed now by both the Republican and Democratic leaders in the state legislature in Missouri, that they go to having elections when people actually tend to vote, which is elections where they have governors and senators and presidents elected. Maybe Ferguson would have been better served with a government that more reflected its people and more served its needs. Maybe Ferguson, and again, I'm not in favor of quotas, but it was a little odd that 51 of the 53 police officers in Ferguson were white in a community that was 67% black. That doesn't create the most obvious environment for good police-citizen relationships when the imbalance is that great. So I think we have to address this issue not just in fiscal terms, but in sociological terms, in community terms, and frankly, in moral terms. You cannot have the kind of debt level that you have in local cities in Texas, which ultimately is going to put pressure on the state budget indirectly, on top of the fact that the federal government sends Texas 34% of its state budget, and you're dancing to the tune of Washington, and as more and more burdens on Medicaid and Obamacare and everything else come down on you, the pressure for you to raise taxes is going to be inevitable because of people beyond your control in Washington. You need to look as much as you can at home. And this local bonding scandal, which is all over Texas, and I know it's partly about football, and I know that's the third, fourth, and fifth rail, but I'm getting out of Dodge, so you can't get me after I leave on the plane. So I can say it's partly about football. You've got to address this. When 2,363 people can vote for a $60 million stadium that is no longer used, this is not democracy, this is not fiscal prudence, this is a scam. And it's a scam that benefits some of the wealthiest and most politically connected people in the state, and it's the average, hardworking, middle class, lower middle class, inner city person who pays the bill, and they're getting the shaft. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fund. At this time, I'd like to take an opportunity for any of the panelists to ask any other questions amongst themselves or clarification. You have any questions for each other?
I'd like to follow up on what he said.
Sure.
I think you make a great point about elections, trying to have elections when people vote. My dad, who was 93, passed away this fall, but I remember one time he said, you know, we ought to do it like Belgium does it. And
Well,
what I said,
they fine people.
I said, how's that? He said, every citizen has to go vote. Now, you can go and check a box, I don't vote for any of these bozos, but you have to go do it. And I said, boy, that'd be great, wouldn't it? And then I thought a minute, you know, that's called not freedom, you know? Now, I just want to make one
They
point.
speak French in Belgium, that's also France.
Yeah. I want to make one point. Philosophically, the rest of those people in Allen voted when they didn't vote, and they cast their vote for apathy, and that's the problem. I'm all about trying to figure that out, but you know what? The people that cared went and voted, and they could have voted it down. Sorry, I got the percentage wrong. Personally, you know, if I'd lived in Allen, I'd have gone and voted against it, and I'd have tried to rally people about it. And I'm an old football player, but my point is this. You didn't go vote, you voted.
But
Tell me where I'm wrong.
would you agree that rolling polling is a manipulation of the process?
Yeah, I think that's
Okay,
terrible.
okay.
I think that's terrible. I've vaguely heard about it, but to be real honest with you, it hadn't been on anybody's radar screen real big.
That's why I'm here.
Judge, let me defer to you, please. Yeah,
Yes, sir. Right here.
County Judge of Collin County, Keith Self.
You bet. I would love to address the rolling polling issue. I'm the county judge. For those of you that don't know, we have about a third of Richardson, which Mr. Fund mentioned. We have about 60% of Frisco, and we have Plano, all of Plano, minus a very small part. So I'm the county judge for these issues. First of all, Senator, you're exactly right about apathy. That's all over the state. This percentage is not different than most places. The rolling polling, though, I was very concerned about because counties run elections, but we contract with the cities to do their school bond elections. So as the county judge, I was very concerned about the rolling polling in Frisco, so I went and made sure that we were meeting state law. So this is the state law that if you're open for a certain number of hours, and it has to be a minimum of a certain number of hours, that you must be open at each location. Frisco, in their request, in our contract, we met state law. So Senator, I will turn it back to you.
Sounds
because
like a good bill in the making.
absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And Judge, I'd love your business card before I leave because I'm going to be writing about this. So thank you. Thank you.
All right, we've got about 10 minutes for some Q&A, so if you would raise your hand and we'll get the mic over to you. Right over here. Microphone, please.
My question is about taxes, and you're talking about taxes that help the future economy. And if we think about where growth is going to come in Texas, a lot of it is going to come from our startup community, from our small business community. And we always talk about corporations and companies, and we kind of scoop up all those little guys with that language, but we're not really talking about the little guys. The margin tax is not a good tax for startup and small businesses. And the arbitrariness of it was devastating to a number of them. The question is, what kind of a tax system incentivizes startups and small business growth? That's what you want.
Let me make a quick comment. Right now, we have $1 million gross receipts exemption. Okay, there's a proposal, somebody's got a bill to increase, who's that? Yeah, anyway, to increase it to 5 million. I would argue that 1 million, if you're gonna keep the tax, which I don't wanna do, that ought to change. And because even a modestly successful single standalone restaurant can easily do over 1 million in gross revenue a year. So there has been some effort to try to shield the really small businesses from this onerous tax, but obviously people are talking about the fact that 1 million is probably too low.
Any others?
Want to add to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Directly to your question of what sort of taxes encourage growth of new businesses, taxes with broad bases and low rates, not taxes that have all sorts of carve-outs for this or that activity. Sometimes these things have incredible names too. I mean, the jobs credit, the investment credit. I love jobs. I love investment. I just think that when we put those things in the tax code, it means we have to have an overall higher rate. And then you have to go searching for people that want to come locate in your state, as opposed to letting the market direct capital. I think that increasing the exemption to $5 million would be good. I mean, it would be a welcome change. But I'm now thinking about killing the snake while you have the hoe in your hand, because as soon as you narrow out that base more, the tax doesn't collect as much revenue as you want, which is a concern that everybody has, and it becomes less effective. It's really hard to repeal a tax that almost no one pays, but is hugely onerous for the few businesses that do pay.
Well, we can tweak it all we want, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be the snake. The
Sure.
snake,
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Question right over here.
Yes.
Senator Estes, you mentioned that it's not bringing in what people thought it would bring in. And
No, but they forecast it was going to bring in X, and it.
I think that's blow number one. Number two, I could go on for days, but I won't, about personal stories. I know compliance costs. Do any of you have any numbers?
They're huge.
That really can illustrate that for your audience today?
I've heard some accounting firms had to double the charge for filing returns as opposed to the older system. Double, maybe triple in some cases. That does it for me. That tells me that the tax is too complex and we could do things to make it more simple.
Anyone else? All right. I have a question right back here.
I think we haven't talked about the historical perspective of how this thing came into being, because we were
Introduce
there
yourself.
when this happened.
Introduce yourself.
Corbin Van Arsdale with AGC. I used to serve in the House. And if other states are looking at this tax because we're creating a lot of jobs, that's foolish, because they don't understand how this thing came into being. And the reason this thing came into being was that we're already taxing a company profits. But what happened was companies were reorganizing themselves as partnerships, limited liability partnerships, including little companies like Dell and Southwestern Bell, were reincorporating themselves as limited liability partnerships and getting the protections of corporate protections, but they were not having it. Now they were no longer paying any business tax, whereas a lot of the smaller companies couldn't afford to do that, and they still were paying. So what happened was when the court came out and said school finance system is unconstitutional, well, the Texas Constitution bars the legislature from taxing property, and the Texas Constitution bars the legislature from taxing income. So you don't have a lot of, there are not a lot of other things the state does. So what they ended up doing was starting taxing property through the local districts. And then when the court said, hey, you got to do it by June or we're going to shut the schools down, that's when this came into being. And if you recall, people were bringing in, let's lower the sales tax, and people tried that and it failed. Let's do gambling. That failed. When it was all said and done, 3 Republican leaders in this state, Rick Perry, David Dewhurst, and Tom Craddock, passed this tax because it was meant to approximate a tax on profits, but doing it through a gross receipts, basically a little game system, bringing all those guys back in that were left out under limited liability. But at the time, if y'all remember this, the leadership thought, and by the way, the Democrats were the ones that voted against this, not the Republicans, okay? And if you remember that what happened at that time, they felt like taxing partnerships was going to be an unconstitutional tax on income. We have since the last session, had a ruling by the Supreme Court that taxing partnerships is not a tax on personal income. And so I'm kind of, the question, all that being said, the question is for the legislature.
Which I disagree with.
Now that but the court says that a tax on a partnership is a tax on the entity, not the individual. So now that that's out there, can the legislature go back to more of a franchise, a tax on profit, as opposed to this sort of gamemanship thing that we've got this cobbled together margins tax?
Thank you.
Let me just say, and thank you for that historical perspective, and you're absolutely right on that. I think it's a lot easier to just axe it than it is to try to reform it again. If we reform it again, you know, it's like a camel's a horse made by a committee, right? We kind of resemble that sometimes.
But I think, if I can just add, because I'm not here to advocate for it or against it. I mean, we did go through a lot of debate in 2006, and that it went through many, many changes. I think the one big question is, if you axe it totally, the $5 billion per year, do we not replace it? What do you replace it with, and how do you replace it? Maybe some would advocate that we not replace it, the revenue at all. But if you don't replace the revenue at all, then what do you do with the transportation system in the state of Texas? What in this biennium, I think $3.6 billion of that $5 billion is going to the property tax relief for the schools. Okay, so if you don't replace it, then what are you suggesting? Does the infrastructure in the state of Texas lag behind? Because businesses do look at the infrastructure of any state. So what do you do? You just can't. And what about the diversions? Do you not do the diversions? And what about the dedicated accounts where we are taking money from one source and spending it for another? Do you continue to do that? So it's not just like, okay, we don't like it, let's get rid of it, we're done with it. There are huge ramifications for the business, and not just the state's business, but people who are doing business and people who are living in this state. There are huge ramifications if you do not fill that hole.
Let me just say, those are really good questions, Sylvester, and we can't dodge them. We've got to firmly address it, and that's what we're doing. That's what y'all are doing over in the House as we start this. We're having these debates right now in small groups about, do we want property tax relief? Do we want margins tax relief? How do we fund essential services? And so, you know, I'm filing a bill to end the sporting goods sales tax diversion, which is just one of many diversions.
And I support you on that.
Yeah, and I get where you're coming from, but that's also the question you need to answer. Okay, these things are, as bad as it is diverting them, they're being diverted for a reason and for something else. A totally different situation than just sitting on a pile of money that you're not giving to the people that it's intended for.
Right.
So if you end all diversions, then you've got to come up with some money for schools. It's a thorny problem. And by the way, this is not a problem that has just cropped up recently. It's been with us for, I don't know how many.
Long time.
At least 20 years. So we're wrestling with that. But I'll restate what I stated in my opening comments, and that is the economic impact of job creation will be real if we do this. And granted, I will grant it will take a few years to see this, but we realize that businesses pay most. It's 55, 58%, something like that, of the property taxes. As businesses thrive, they will pay property taxes on their inventory and all those good things. So, I can't tell you it will be a wash. No, I think there would have to be some judicious cuts. What I'm saying is it's doable. And so that's what we're struggling with.
And they also pay a large share of the sales tax.
Absolutely.
As well.
Absolutely.
But the other factor, though, with the price of oil going down since June to where we are today, the appraisals for property for oil, gas, and mineral properties are discounted based on future forecasts, so to speak.
That's correct.
And so, because the price of oil has gone down, I can assure you that these companies are going to come in and say their previous appraisals are now too high. They need to go down, and that is an amount that we cannot ignore. I mean, you cannot ignore the realities and things that are happening in real time. Right. I'm not a champion of the franchise tax, but I am a champion of this state remaining to continuing to be open so people and businesses can see this as a viable state in which to do business in. And if you don't invest in it, and if you don't take care of your infrastructure, and if the transportation system goes to pot, then what do you have?
Why didn't my housing appraisal go down during the housing drop? My house wasn't worth as much, but the taxing district didn't think so.
The local appraisal district.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I don't argue that. You got different levels of government that are operating with different agendas.
Just one buck, it all went up.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much, panelists. It's been a great discussion. Hopefully we can